Donald Trump once made a very specific claim about himself, a 180 IQ, the kind of number meant to place him in a category far beyond ordinary intelligence. He has also described himself as a stable genius, pointed to his education and business career, and repeatedly presented his memory, instincts, and accomplishments as proof that he is exceptionally intelligent. In the dramatic account provided in the source material, Stephen Colbert decided to focus on that claim instead of getting dragged into another shouting match with Trump. Colbert played the clip, let Trump make the claim in his own words, and then asked the question that changed the entire conversation. Where is the proof? The point was not that Trump had to prove he was unintelligent. The point was that an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence, especially when the person making it repeatedly uses intelligence as a weapon against critics. Trump's 180 IQ claim immediately became the center of the discussion because IQ scores are not supposed to work like campaign slogans. A real score comes from an actual assessment, and without documentation showing what test was taken, when it was taken, and how it was scored, nobody can simply verify the number because a public figure says it is true. That distinction became the foundation of Colbert's argument. Instead of saying Trump is dumb, Colbert's approach was much simpler. Show me the record. The source account describes Colbert bringing up Trump's repeated references to Wharton and his claims about being an exceptional student. According to that account, Colbert presented academic material that supposedly did not support the larger story Trump had told about himself. The documents were described as showing ordinary academic performance rather than evidence of extraordinary achievement. The dramatic point was not that ordinary grades are shameful. They are not. Millions of successful people were ordinary students. The problem, as the segment framed it, was the gap between an ordinary academic record and a decades-long public image built around being an intellectual superhuman. Colbert then pushed the argument further. He pointed out that Trump had spent years calling other people low IQ, stupid, losers, or incapable of understanding what he supposedly understood instantly. That made the issue larger than one number. If someone repeatedly uses intelligence as a credential to dismiss everyone else, then eventually people are going to ask whether the credential itself is legitimate. That was the central tension of the segment. Trump was not being challenged on whether he had achieved things. He was being challenged on whether those achievements automatically proved the specific IQ number he kept repeating. And those are two completely different questions. A person can build a huge business and still have no documented 180 IQ. A person can become president and still have no documented 180 IQ. A person can have excellent instincts in one area and struggle in another. Human intelligence is not a single trophy that explains every success. But Trump's public language often turns intelligence into exactly that kind of trophy. In the source account, Colbert used that contradiction against him. Trump claimed the number was proof of his brilliance, while Colbert asked for the evidence behind the number. That is why the confrontation became so effective as television storytelling. The more Trump insisted on the number, the more obvious the unanswered question became. Where did 180 come from? Who administered the test? When was it taken? What test was it? Was there an official report? Was the score independently verified? Those questions are far more difficult to answer than simply saying, I'm a genius. The account then introduces a second element. Old academic comments allegedly describing Trump's work as lacking depth or requiring more analytical development. Whether such documents exist as described is not independently established by the source material, but within the story they become the evidence Colbert uses to challenge the mythology surrounding Trump's intelligence. That contrast creates the dramatic heart of the narrative. On one side is the public claim, 180 IQ, perfect memory, smartest president, greatest instincts. On the other side are supposedly ordinary academic comments telling a very different story. Colbert's argument is that neither side should simply be accepted because it sounds convincing. The record should be examined. The source account describes Colbert making exactly that point when he says the issue is not whether Trump is stupid. The issue is whether the story Trump has told about himself matches the record. That is a much harder question to escape because it does not require name-calling. It requires evidence. Trump's response in the source account follows a familiar pattern: reject the documents, attack the messenger, emphasize success, and return to the claim that winning is the ultimate proof. Trump allegedly argues that he built an empire, became president, and defeated political opponents, making those accomplishments more meaningful than old academic papers. And there is a legitimate argument buried inside that response. Success does matter. Results matter. A person's life cannot be reduced to a transcript from decades ago, but that still does not establish a 180 IQ. That is where Colbert's response becomes especially pointed. If Trump says IQ scores do not matter, then why repeatedly advertise one? If academic records do not matter, why repeatedly cite academic credentials? If success is the only test that matters, why make a precise numerical claim about intelligence at all? The contradiction is the story. Trump's argument moves between two standards depending on which standard benefits him. When the discussion is about IQ, the number supposedly proves his intelligence. When the number is questioned, suddenly IQ does not matter. When academic credentials are useful, they become evidence of brilliance. When academic records are criticized, they become irrelevant because success matters more. Colbert does not need to win an argument about whether Trump is smart. He only needs to point out that the standards keep changing. That is what makes the claim vulnerable. The source account then takes the confrontation into more dramatic territory, describing Trump appearing remotely and becoming increasingly angry as Colbert continues questioning the claim. Again, the underlying event as described in the source should be treated as a dramatic narrative rather than independently verified footage. But as a script, the sequence is built around one simple contrast. Trump becomes louder while Colbert becomes calmer. That contrast is repeated throughout the story because it reinforces the central theme. Trump responds with accusations. Colbert responds with documents. Trump says fake. Colbert asks for proof. Trump attacks Colbert. Colbert returns to the original question. Trump talks about success. Colbert asks about the specific IQ number. Every time the conversation moves away from evidence, Colbert brings it back. That is the entire strategy. And it is much more effective than trying to out-insult Trump. When Trump calls someone low IQ, the obvious response would be another insult. Colbert instead turns the phrase back into a question. If intelligence is so important, then let's actually examine the evidence. The source account describes a moment where the supposed IQ figure is presented as 124 rather than 180. That specific number should not be presented as a verified fact because the source does not provide an independently verifiable testing record establishing it. But within the dramatic story, that is the moment designed to destroy the 180 claim. The reaction is immediate. The audience laughs and reacts to the enormous gap between the two numbers. Yet the more important point is not whether 124 is the correct number. The important point is that there is no reliable basis in the source material for treating either 124 or 180 as an established fact. That actually makes the central argument stronger. If the number cannot be independently documented, then the audience should not accept it simply because Trump repeats it. The story then shifts from the IQ number to a broader question about self-presentation. Why does Trump emphasize intelligence so much? Why repeatedly call himself a genius? Why repeatedly describe opponents as low IQ? Why use intelligence as a dividing line between himself and everyone else? Colbert's answer, according to the narrative, is that Trump has turned intelligence into part of his political identity. The number becomes less like a measurement and more like a symbol. It tells supporters that he is uniquely capable. It tells critics that their objections can be dismissed. It creates a simple hierarchy. Trump is the genius. Everyone who disagrees is the idiot. But real intelligence does not work that way. Intelligence is not proven by confidence. It is not proven by repetition. It is not proven by how loudly someone dismisses another person, and it certainly is not proven by an unsupported number. That is the uncomfortable question the segment forces into the open. Colbert then reportedly makes another important distinction. There is nothing embarrassing about being an ordinary student. That matters because otherwise the segment becomes nothing more than another political attack. A person does not need perfect grades to become successful. A person does not need a genius IQ to lead a company. A person does not need academic honors to become president. There is no shame in being average in one area and exceptional in another. The real issue is what happens when an ordinary record is transformed into a legendary story and then used to claim superiority over everyone else. That is the argument the source places at the center of Colbert's monologue. The problem is not being ordinary. The problem is pretending ordinary evidence proves extraordinary claims. And once that argument is established, the 180 number begins to look less like information and more like branding. The number is memorable. It is outrageous. It sounds impressive. It is easy to repeat, and that makes it politically useful even if nobody can independently verify it. This is how public myths can grow. A person says something about himself. Supporters repeat it. The media repeats it while discussing the controversy. Critics repeat it while mocking it. Eventually, the number becomes familiar. Familiarity can make a claim feel true even when nobody has actually checked the source. That is why Colbert's strategy in the story is based on slowing the conversation down. Instead of allowing the number to become another slogan, he asks viewers to stop and examine it. The source describes him returning repeatedly to the same basic point: where is the evidence? That question is difficult to defeat with insults. It does not care whether the person asking it is popular. It does not care whether the person being questioned is powerful. It does not care whether the audience supports one political party or another. Either there is documentation or there is not. And that is why the confrontation becomes larger than Trump and Colbert. It becomes a lesson about how public figures construct credibility. A politician can say he is the smartest person alive. A celebrity can say she has the best memory. A CEO can say he is a genius. None of those statements become facts simply because they are repeated. The public has to decide whether the evidence supports them. The source account also describes Trump responding by saying that success is the real test. That line creates another interesting problem. Success and intelligence overlap, but they are not interchangeable. Success can come from persistence, timing, opportunity, connections, risk tolerance, communication skills, leadership, luck, money, or dozens of other factors. Intelligence can contribute to success, but success does not allow us to calculate a person's IQ backward. If a billionaire has no documented IQ test, his wealth does not magically produce an IQ score. If a president wins an election, the election result does not become an intelligence test. If a businessman negotiates a major deal, that deal does not tell us his exact IQ. So when Trump allegedly says his achievements are proof that the IQ number must be true, Colbert's counter-argument becomes straightforward. Achievements prove achievements. They do not automatically prove a specific psychological measurement. That distinction is simple enough for anyone to understand. And it is exactly why the 180 claim is such a powerful subject for a late-night segment. The number sounds scientific, but the way it is used is emotional. It is not presented as a technical measurement to be discussed by psychologists. It is presented as a shortcut. I am smarter, therefore my judgment is better. My judgment is better, therefore my critics are wrong. My critics are wrong, therefore their evidence can be dismissed. Once that chain is accepted, the number becomes a shield against accountability. Colbert's response breaks the chain at the first step. Prove the number. If the number cannot be proven, then it cannot be used as proof of everything that follows. The source account then introduces even more dramatic allegations about old academic papers, professors, and even other students supposedly completing work for Trump. Those claims are particularly serious and are not established by the provided source as independently verified facts. They should therefore remain part of the fictionalized or dramatized framing rather than being presented as confirmed history. But their role in the narrative is clear. They are designed to increase the distance between the public myth and the supposed private record. The bigger the gap, the more dramatic the confrontation becomes. The story moves from Trump says he has a 180 IQ to Trump says he was an exceptional student to old documents supposedly show something different to Trump rejects the documents to Colbert keeps asking for evidence. That escalation is what gives the script its momentum. Every new claim creates another question. Every question creates another response. Every response reveals another contradiction. And eventually the argument stops being about one IQ score. It becomes about credibility itself. Can a person repeatedly make extraordinary claims about himself and expect those claims to remain unquestioned forever? That is the deeper question underneath the entire story. Trump's political career has always involved enormous claims. Greatest, best, tremendous. Nobody does it better. The words are part of his public vocabulary. Supporters often interpret that confidence as strength. Critics interpret it as exaggeration. But regardless of political viewpoint, there is a difference between confidence and evidence. Confidence tells people what you believe about yourself. Evidence gives them a reason to believe it too. That distinction is exactly where Colbert's calm approach becomes effective. He does not need to establish that Trump is unintelligent. He needs only to establish that the 180 claim is unsupported. And if the claim is unsupported, then it should not be treated as established fact. That is the point viewers can evaluate for themselves. The source narrative describes Trump becoming increasingly frustrated as the conversation continues. He reportedly calls the documents fake, attacks Colbert, accuses the show of being biased, and repeats the same phrases about being the smartest person to run for president. That repetition becomes important because it shows what happens when a person has no new evidence to add. The argument becomes circular. I am the smartest because I say I am the smartest. The evidence is fake because it contradicts me. The critics are low IQ because they question me. And the reason the evidence is fake is because I am the smartest. That is not proof. It is a closed loop. Colbert's method breaks that loop by refusing to argue inside it. He does not respond to every insult. He does not defend his intelligence. He does not start listing his own accomplishments. He simply returns to the original question. Where is the evidence for 180? That is why the confrontation works rhetorically. It keeps the burden of proof where it belongs, on the person making the extraordinary claim. The source account then describes Colbert saying that numbers do not define a person, but that if someone spends years using a number to attack everyone else, eventually someone is going to examine it. That is probably the strongest idea in the entire story. A number should not define a person. IQ is only one limited measure of certain cognitive abilities, and even a verified score would not tell us whether someone is wise, ethical, emotionally intelligent, creative, disciplined, compassionate, or capable of making good decisions under pressure. So why obsess over it? Because Trump does not merely mention intelligence as one part of his personality. In the story, intelligence becomes a weapon. The phrase low IQ becomes a dismissal. Someone does not need to answer the criticism if the critic can simply be labeled stupid. That is much easier than engaging with the argument. But it also creates a vulnerability. Once intelligence becomes the standard you use to judge everyone else, people are naturally going to ask whether you can meet the same standard. That is exactly what Colbert does. He applies the ruler back to the person holding it. The narrative then reaches its biggest rhetorical moment when Colbert stops talking about IQ altogether. He says, in essence, that intelligence should be visible in judgment, learning, careful thinking, and responsibility. That is a much more meaningful definition than a number. Someone can have an extraordinary IQ and still make terrible decisions. Someone can have an average IQ and demonstrate excellent judgment. Someone can be highly educated and still be foolish. Someone can have no impressive academic credentials and still understand people better than anyone in the room. Real intelligence is complicated because human ability is complicated. That is why reducing the entire concept to 180 is so easy to mock. The number becomes a costume. It looks impressive from a distance, but it does not tell you how the person actually thinks. And that is where the story delivers its final lesson. The strongest evidence of intelligence is not saying you are intelligent. It is demonstrating the ability to examine evidence, admit uncertainty, change your mind when the facts demand it, distinguish between what you know and what you believe, and answer difficult questions without attacking the person asking them. That standard applies to everyone, including politicians, comedians, business leaders, and presidents. It does not matter whether the person is Donald Trump or someone nobody has ever heard of. If you claim an extraordinary IQ, show the documentation. If you claim academic excellence, show the academic record. If you claim perfect memory, demonstrate it. If you claim to be the smartest person in the room, then the room should be able to judge that for itself. That is the difference between self-promotion and proof. And that is why the dramatic Colbert versus Trump story works even beyond the politics. The real conflict is not Democrat versus Republican. It is claim versus evidence. Trump's political identity is built heavily around confidence. Colbert's counter-strategy is built around skepticism. Trump says, "Believe me." Colbert effectively responds, "Show me." Those two phrases represent completely different approaches to credibility. Believe me asks for trust. Show me asks for verification. In an age where politicians, influencers, celebrities, and online personalities can make millions of people believe almost anything through repetition, the second approach is increasingly important. The source account ends with the myth collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. Whether or not the specific televised confrontation described actually occurred exactly as presented, the underlying lesson remains clear. An unsupported IQ claim should not be treated as established fact, and neither political power nor personal success can substitute for evidence. The 180 number is memorable because it is enormous. But that is also why it needs proof. Without proof, it remains a claim, and a claim repeated 1,000 times is still a claim. That is the part Colbert's calm response exposes most effectively. He does not need to prove Trump is stupid. He does not need to prove Trump is brilliant either. He only needs to remind the audience that neither conclusion should be reached from a number that has not been independently established. The moment the conversation shifts from personality to evidence, the entire dynamic changes. The person with the loudest voice no longer automatically controls the argument. The person with the biggest title no longer automatically wins. The person with the most supporters no longer automatically has the strongest evidence. The question becomes brutally simple. Can the claim survive verification? If yes, accept it. If no, stop repeating it as fact. That is the real lesson behind the 180 IQ controversy. Intelligence is not a crown you place on your own head. It is not a magic number that makes every decision correct. It is not a shield that protects someone from criticism. And it certainly is not something that becomes true because a politician says, "Believe me." In the dramatic story, Colbert's biggest advantage was not a secret document or a devastating insult. It was patience. He let Trump make the claim. He let the audience hear it. He asked the question. Then he waited. That is what made the moment feel so different. There was no need to compete with the volume of the claim. The claim was already loud enough. All Colbert had to do was make the audience look closely at it. And once people start looking closely, the difference between confidence and evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Trump can say 180. Anyone can say 180. The number itself is easy. Proving it is the hard part. That is why the strongest line in the entire story is not an insult at all. It is the question underneath everything. Where is the evidence? Because when someone claims to be the smartest person in the room, the smartest response is not necessarily to call them stupid. Sometimes it is simply to ask them to prove what they just said. And once the proof becomes the standard, the performance is over. The slogans stop mattering. The insults stop mattering. The applause stops mattering. The only thing left is the record. That is where the supposed 180 IQ claim ultimately runs into its biggest problem. Not ridicule, not politics, and not even Colbert himself, but verification. And if there is one thing viewers should take away from the entire controversy, it is this. Never confuse confidence with intelligence. Never confuse success with a specific IQ score, and never confuse repetition with proof. A person who truly values intelligence should welcome evidence, questions, scrutiny, and correction. A person who demands that everyone accept a claim simply because he said it is asking for something very different. That is why Colbert's calm approach lands harder than another angry exchange ever could. He does not have to overpower Trump. He only has to stop the conversation long enough for the audience to ask the question Trump's own boast created. 180 IQ. Fine. Where did the number come from? Show the test. Show the report. Show the evidence. Until then, it is not a verified measurement. It is simply a claim. And that is the entire point. The loudest declaration in the room is not necessarily the smartest one. Sometimes the smartest response is the quietest question.